And I always tell everybody, if you get to some event and there's 100 people there and there's two hunters in the group, they're going to find each other within about 30 minutes and talk about hunting the rest of the time.
Hi, I'm Spook Spann.
And I'm Brian Stevens.
Welcome to the 11th Commandment,
a podcast about how chasing big whitetails has become a religion to us. The plan is to get into the head of one of the most successful whitetail hunters on the planet
and to share over 40 plus years of hunting experience with you. Big bucks, life, and America. Here we go.
Welcome to the 11th Commandment, brought to you by Spook Nation. I'm Brian Stevens here with Mr. Spook Spann. How you doing today, my man?
Doing great.
Good. I think we've got a guest today that I'm excited about, Mr. Mike Logan. Before you introduce Mike, today I just wanted to highlight that this is about a topic that we've gotten a lot of questions on, and it's about management. And obviously people know that you're a killer. We can see it behind you. But what goes into that? It's not just hunting other people's property. It's many of those deer are based on properties that you've owned or managed, and the strategy and the science that goes into growing big deer. And that's really what we want to focus on today. And you have not only the hunting side of it, but the expertise and actually a whole business that you run on managing properties for success. And I know Mike is somebody you've helped. So I'll let you take it from here and dig into that.
Yeah, well, I'm excited about having my buddy Mike Logan on here. We've known each other for several years, and Mike had came to me when he was ready to buy some property, and he wanted to get in. He's from Nashville, Tennessee, obviously, and he wanted to get into somewhere that had better deer and better genetics. And he was, looking at Kentucky, ended up buying some land in Kentucky. And then I started helping him with habitat management. And I offer this service, based on the fact that just all the, years of knowledge and trial and error. And Mike is one of the few people that actually took my advice and went all in. I mean, every single thing that I, suggested that he and his partner do on their properties, they have done, plus some. And it's just made a tremendous difference in the quality of their hunting and their experience. And I really enjoy talking to Mike about it because he really gets into it, and I can tell he's enjoying the process, which is always the way I've been, to see the fruits of your labor. And then when, you see that big buck on camera and then see him walk into the food plot, it's just priceless. And so I'll obviously introduce Mike Logan from Nashville, Tennessee, landowner, deer hunter, and we'll just get into some of the things that we have talked about over the years and things I've advised you on, and then things that you've picked up on listening to other podcasts and to other people, and what you see as different about the way I've handled things with you.
Maybe just give a little bit of background as far as, your property and what it looked like in the beginning, why you chose that property, and then at what point you engaged Spook, and then you guys can, get into some of the specific strategies. But give everybody a little bit of background of your thought process of why you chose that farm and what you were hoping to accomplish based on, your original purchase of it.
Yeah, can do. Let me just start with a little bit of mine and Spook's relationship. Probably goes back close to 20 years. I couldn't say exactly what, and it was kind of luck that I found Spook. Our daughters were in school together, and I always tell everybody, if you get to some event and there's 100 people there and there's two hunters in the group, they're going to find each other within about 30 minutes and talk about hunting the rest of the time. And that's kind of the way we got started, just talking about hunting at these school events and stuff like that. So it kind of started there. Yeah. On the land deal, was very fortunate. I started looking in about 2010, and if anything about land and what's happened in the last 25 years, I probably couldn't have hit it any better. Yeah. You were about 2 years post the financial crisis, and land prices were probably as good as they've been in the last 25 years. So I kind of got lucky there. And my buddy and I bought a tract in late fall of 2010, and then we bought another tract in late summer of 2011. So within 2 years, we bought our 2 tracts of property. And, what I'd say is unique about those properties is both of them were a blank slate, meaning it was 99.9% timbered properties with no openings or anything like that. So we were starting in a really good spot. And I can tell you, they went 2 different tracks, 2 different directions, which is kind of important here. One of them was an old West Vaco piece of property, so it had some pines on it. It wasn't 100% pines, but it had some pines on the ridge tops. And the other one was just, hardwood timber. And the first one, I got to talking to Spook and figuring out how to set this thing up, where to put the food plots, how to get in and out, and those types of things were the things we were talking about. Followed that advice, and it was pretty much a no-brainer. That pine wasn't worth a whole lot. We cut the pine, made the food plots, and what we made off the pine timber was about enough to pay for the bulldozer work. And I think we spent our last $700 we got off the timber on putting lime down on the properties, on the food plots. The other one, I had about a year or so after getting it, I had a forester come in and walk it and look at the timber and stuff like that. And he was kind of leaning towards, you ought to let this grow. It's not super old timber and stuff like that. So I was kind of torn on what to do with that property. But man, after having cut that first property and seeing what that did, the first 2 or 3 years after doing that, I realized pretty quick, I didn't buy this to be in the timber business. I bought this as a hunting property. And so in 2016, we started cutting on the other property, and I mean, it just made a world of difference. So
you remember what I told you? I said, you decide whether you want to be a hunter or a timber manager. Even though timber management is, I understand where he was coming from on that. And if you were managing it strictly as a long-term investment for timber, he was right. But when you're managing it for wildlife, especially deer, you need to address it that way.
Yeah, and a lot of the timber stand improvement and stuff you're hearing about today, it couldn't be more true. That we hunted those first year or two with just closed canopy forest, I'll call it, and we would see a deer here and a deer there and no good bucks. And I mean, when we put those first food plots in, I remember it was the ugliest food plots you've ever seen. We had some peas and some brown top millet and stuff like there, and you'd get a trail camera picture and it would be a lot of bare dirt out there. But in that picture was also about 15 deer in one picture. So it was making a huge difference right from the get-go.
So, Mike, let me ask you, of your total acreage in Spook, so you guys, as you think about this, what percent of the timber do you decide to cut and make more of that open canopy versus leaving some of it thick? So just talk a little bit about how you determine how much you do want to cut to improve the habitat, but not over cutting and thinning it out too much.
Now, really, Spook, I'll let you go first.
Yeah,
here.
Really, it comes down to how much land you've got to work with is a big part of it. But always in hardwoods, you're going to have hillsides that are poor and not going to be very conducive to growing mature quality hardwood. That's always a good place to do food plots and or plant pines. And then the quality hardwood areas, you're pretty much going to do a select cut over the entire thing.
Okay.
Now, that's not to say if you find a clump of really, say, 10 or 12 really nice white oaks in a strategic spot where there's a saddle or some kind of funnel or some kind of area that you can get in and out of really good, that you could see this would be a spot that I would hunt when there's a lot of acorns. You might leave a little spot, an acre or so in a place like that somewhere, but mostly you're going to cut the whole thing. And then it's good to do some clear cuts also in some places, especially on those poor hillsides or poor ridges, where you can do controlled burns every every year, every other year, or every third year. And Mike has done a really good job. That was one of those things that intimidates a lot of people. When I make that suggestion, it didn't Mike at all. He actually does those himself and does a great job, and it's made a huge difference.
Yeah, the cutting, just what Spook said. I mean, this is all about sunlight getting to the forest floor, and obviously, the harder you cut the timber, the more sunlight that's going to get to the forest floor. And you know, you don't just want a monoculture property out there where it all looks the same. So cutting differently across your property, harder in some areas and less in others, and then maybe in some areas, particularly like if you're thinking about where you might access your stands, maybe you don't cut that at all. Leave that closed canopy so you can get in and out of that property. It's not a place where deer are going to want to hang out, and you can get in and out of your stands, you know, through a closed canopy piece of the forest where you're not likely to bump into deer going in and out.
No, that's a great point. And Mike, I mean, one of the, I think, signature things that Spook talks about in his success is what you just said, and that is the ability to get in and out as undetected as possible. And that may vary in the morning or the afternoon. So that's a great point that you bring up. So, all right. So you talked about the timber, the thinning. What was some of the other things? And I'm sure your first food plot wasn't super sexy, but I'm sure over time that got better. What were some of those other evolutions that started to happen within the property?
Well, one of the first things Spook told me is, you know, once you pick your food plot area where you're going to put your food plot, then you need to pick the tree you're going to kill the deer out of. And that sounds pretty simple, but I mean, that is a fact. That, you know, the properties we have are not flat properties. They've got hills, so your food plots can only go in certain areas. There's only certain spots on the property where you're going to be able to put a food plot in. And then you got to start considering access. And when I say access, that's picking the tree you're going to kill the deer out of. So you got to think about prevailing winds. Where's the wind going to be coming from most of the time? It's not always going to come from the same area, but you know, if you can get a west, a northwest, and a southwest, and maybe a north, you know, if you can get all those working for you, you're going to be able to hunt that stand, you know, probably 75% of the time. And those are the things you got to think about. And I'll just say these are very, very important decisions when you're talking about a blank slate, what I have, because the cycles of learning are huge. You can't put this food plot in and then next year decide you want it somewhere else. It's done once it's done.
Yep.
So these are all things you got to think about on the front end.
No, that's great. That's great. So what were some other things that you started to implement based on working with Spook? What was maybe phase 2?
Well, I mean, the land management, it was setting the property up was huge. And I think that's where most people get intimidated. But I think one of the things that's I've become aware of and just kind of figured out through, and Spook was telling me this stuff from the get-go, is just the hunting strategies. You know, it's one thing to have the buck stay on your property. It's another thing to have him come into the food plot and come in a way where A, it's still daylight, and B, you can kill him. Because we're talking a lot of this, we're talking about early. We're not talking about rut hunting here. We're talking about early season hunting, and you know, you're going to be hunting.
Yep.
You're going to be, and late season, right? You're going to be hunting with primitive weapons most of the time, so it's going to be up close stuff. So to go out there and put a 10-acre food plot, you might attract every deer in the county into your food plot if you got a good food source out there. That doesn't mean you're going to kill any of them though with a bow in your hand.
No, that's a great point. So when you were looking at the food plots and the food sources, were you guys talking about the rotation of, you know, what types of food to put in there for that area? Did you guys get into those kind of discussions?
For
Yeah,
sure.
it's mostly about, I mean, most of the time you're going to do something that's green. You're going to do clover or, you know, a wintertime mix or a combination of those. You know, it's always good if you can if you're in a position where you have a place that's big enough to swap corn and beans out. But a lot of times, most of the time in these food plot situations, people are planting clover or some combination of clover with something else. And yes, you do strategize on rotation if you have something that's big enough and good enough. But really, the strategy comes in is providing bedding areas close enough to the food plots. And these are some of the things that Mike's talking about, where the deer gets there before it gets dark, and you're sitting in a spot in the transition spot where he's going to enter that food plot close enough for you to get a shot with a bow. And I think Mike brought up something earlier, and I'd like for him to address that, just about how, yes, I like to help people with their habitat management, but I'm looking at it from a hunting standpoint, not just from a, improving the habitat standpoint.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I'm looking at all these deer behind you there, Spook, and we haven't talked about this that much, but for all those successes that are hanging on the wall behind you, there's probably twice as many failures, and that's how
For
people
sure.
learn stuff. And that's where I've really picked Spook's brain over the years is, how's this going to go? It's gone about exactly the way he told me it would go. You're going to have to do X, Y, and Z. And we're talking about some of these things right now, but he just mentioned a huge, huge thing. And that is, you got to have bedding cover right up against your food. And it's got to be on the opposite side of your access, where your wind is going to be good. I mean, I would say, I'll just say this. I can credit Spook for really limiting the number of days I get to hunt in Kentucky, because Kentucky is a $1 state, and last year I killed a mid 160s buck, a 6-year-old buck, on the third afternoon I sat. So I was doe hunting after that, and that was on October 2nd.
Wow.
So it's happening. If you start doing these things right, you really, I mean, the way I like to say it is, there's random hunting, which is the rut. It's totally random. And there's predictive hunting, which is early and late, after pre-rut and post-rut. And I was listening to a podcast the other day where the guest was talking about his favorite days of the season were the first 10 days of October. He was hunting Iowa, and I think that's the opening of their season, must be October 1st, just listening to him talk. And the host was a little bit puzzled by that, and saying, what about Halloween? I always really like Halloween. Well, I think that's where people really don't understand. Those are two different deer seasons. Halloween, you're hunting a rutting buck, and within the random period, that probably is some of the best days. And I know Spook's had some good days. I've heard you guys talk about it on this podcast of hunting around Halloween. So for the rut, that's probably some of the best. But the further you can get away,
it's still primarily based on hunting around food and hoping
true.
that the doe that's coming in heat is coming to the food, and he comes in there with her. And so it's everything I do for the most part is based on providing the best food source possible. But there's nothing like providing natural food sources, natural browse, natural things that grow from the earth, whatever it is. It doesn't matter whether it's corn, beans, alfalfa, clover, brassicas, wheat, oats. It's things that it's better. It's deer are going to be more attracted to it than they are if you're just pouring out something out of a bag.
Yep, no doubt. But yeah, where Spook really helped me out was on the predictive part. Just that early season. And we got some kids, some juvenile hunters that don't even know who Spook is, but they owe him a lot because we put them on the biggest bucks of their life. and knowingly do so. I've told my buddy, I said, you better figure out which kid, a front moves through in the middle of the day on a juvenile hunt weekend. I said, you better figure out which kid you want to kill this big buck because he's going to be coming out,
Yep.
And we're literally out there taking pictures of a mid 160s buck an hour and a half before dark. We killed the deer, took pictures, had the deer out of the woods, and it still wasn't dark yet. That's how well I knew this buck was coming out and how early he came out. So,
well, Mike, that's awesome. And go ahead, Spook.
I was just going to say, and I wanted to wait to the end for this, but I'm afraid I'll forget it. But one of my favorite things, when I asked Mike if he remembers calling me and telling me after about 4 or 5 years or so of, Mike's done, like I said, a tremendous job of implementing the plan, sticking to the plan, maximizing the plan, and capitalizing off the plan. And then he calls me one day after they had killed a buck or two, and you remember what you told me, Mike, when you call me talking about after you do all the preparation, the actual hunting part.
Yeah, I think it's probably what you're referring to is I think you told me it's when we first started, it was not that hard to kill these bucks. And in my mind, I was thinking, you're crazy. It's really hard. They don't even come out in the daylight and that type of stuff. But after 4 or 5 years, I started understanding if you provide what they're looking for, you got to have them living close to the plot, though. That just goes back to what we were saying earlier. If you get them living close to your plot, they are literally probably not more than 100 to 150 yards off of that food source. If you've got the bedding cover where they're like it, they're just generally not going to go that far away. And they get up and they walk 100 yards and they're in the plot in the daylight, and it's not that hard.
Well, look, I mean, I love that. And some people may disagree, but I think to your point, and this goes back to, I think, multiple themes, and that is you've got to create a scenario where they're comfortable to live. And I want to get into that. Like, what are you doing to make them want to live within 100, 150 yards there and stay there? But the success I think you're talking about goes back into watch the weather, have the right wind set up for your stand, getting in and getting out. And Spook and I've talked about this too. I think one of the biggest pressures on a deer is human pressure and finding ways to minimize that. And it sounds like that's what you're talking about. So get into what are you doing, Mike, or what did you do to develop a safe space for them to want to live within 100, 150 yards of that? And whether it was the type of bedding area, it was the transition zones, getting into the actual food source that I think Spook talks about, there's different layers of that.
Well, one thing I was very lucky about was having that closed canopy blank slate, because cutting timber is the easy way to create habitat for deer, because you're making money off of it, hopefully, and you're creating habitat at the same time. There's nothing better. If you've got that scenario, it's awesome. It's just a matter of understanding how you want to set the property up and having a timber guy you can trust. Having a good timber guy is important. And then they're going to do a lot of the work. What a lot of people, and it will be great for a few years afterwards, but that canopy will close back up pretty quick. Within 5 to 10 years after a timber harvest, you're going to see, depending on how hard they cut it, you're going to see that canopy start closing back up. So what do I do, Brian? Every weekend, I pretty much got a chainsaw attached to my right hand, and I'm walking around in the woods in post-cut areas. I've got an area I worked on this weekend that was cut in 2016, 2017 time frame. And I didn't have them cut it hard. So to look at it now, you'd be hard-pressed to even know it was ever cut.
Okay.
And so I'm walking through there. It's a 22-acre section that I'm walking through, and I'm looking for maples. I'm looking for beech. I'm looking for hickory. And I'm leaving most of my oaks unless it's just a really poorly formed oak that's never going to be worth anything. and I'm girdling those things with a chainsaw. If it's leaning the right way and it's not going to damage an oak when it falls or something, I might put it on the ground.
Yeah.
But for probably 70% of them to 80% of them, I'm putting a girdle on them and spraying a little herbicide in that cut. And, in a few months, they'll be dead and sunlight will be getting to the forest floor. And when I say a 22-acre section, I know that because on Onyx, I've got a road around that and I've got it mapped off. So it's one of my burn areas.
Okay.
And so when I burn, it doesn't do any good to burn it if you got a closed canopy forest, because you'll burn the leaf litter off, but no sunlight's going to get to the floor, so nothing's going to come up.
Yeah.
But if you got a 22-acre section that's got a road around it that sits right on the west side of my food plot, which is what this one does, so I'm setting it up for an east side entry coming, that way, and I'm just out there getting sunlight to the forest floor, I'll run a fire. I've run 2 fires through this section already since 2016. I'll probably run another one through there this next year, and it's unbelievable. I'm just rambling, and I could talk about this stuff.
No, this is all good stuff, my man.
But I can tell you, Friday afternoon, I drove around the property about an hour and a half before dark, probably saw about 20 deer, but half of them were in an area half of them were in my food plots. The other half of them were in an area that I burned this past spring, a 17-acre section that I burned this past spring. I saw a real nice buck in there.
Awesome.
What happens, burning is the most underutilized management tool that exists. Some people think it's too much trouble. Some people are scared of it. There's different ways to handle that. It's mainly just becoming aware. These are things you set up when you do your timber harvest, and you map out where you want. Okay, here's where my food plot's going to be based on how I can get in and out, and based on the fact I'm working off of a west, southwest, northwest, north wind mindset. I'm going to go to the opposite end. I'm going to create this 15 to 30, maybe according to how big your property is, could be as big as 50 acres, where I'm going to do, I'm either going to clear cut it, or I'm going to cut it to where my plan is, though, long term, I'm going to burn it off every 3 years. And I'm going to have the logger push out and do his skid trails and his logging trail around the perimeter of that, so that I've got my fire break is automatically formed. So I don't have to go back in there and do that later, because you need a fire break around that particular section to control where your fire, burns off. And then what you like to be able to do, and Mike's done a good job of this, you need at least 3 or 4 areas like this, so that you can burn at least one of them off every year. So what you want to do is you want to burn one off at the 3rd year, and then the next one on the 3rd year, and the next one on the 3rd year, and then the 3rd or 4th year you come back to the first one. So then it's been 3 or 4 years, and then you burn it again. And what happens is, one, obviously, just like Mike said, you're providing the ability for the sunlight to reach the forest floor, because if it doesn't, it's not going to grow any new browse and new forbs and new things for the deer to eat on. The other is that those plants that have grown up above the ground, most of the time what happens is it burns up what's above the ground, but it doesn't kill the root. So as that root gets bigger, it's instead of a root as big as your finger pushing up into a sapling this big, it's a root. It starts becoming a root this big, pushing up into a sapling this big. And so all those nutrients from the soil are coming up into the leaves and the buds off of that browse, and the protein is incredible. And I learned all this from Grant years ago, Grant Woods. And so, Grant, he and I've had 100 conversations about this, and it works so amazingly well. So you establish that in the area where you want your bedding and your browse to take place. And when that food plot's only anywhere from 100 to 300 or 400 yards away from that area, then there's your perfect bedding for them set up. Now, another thing you can do is you can clear cut an area, or if you've got a big enough area of field or pasture, you can plant pines and do the same thing. Just plant them thick, and then there'll come a time when you'll probably have to go in there and girdle them or cut them down and just a different section of them to keep creating, keep that bedding area in there. I like to do both when possible, to have some pines and some of the burn area right next to each other. So you got a double, two types of bedding there close to each other. But it could be switchgrass, it could be a number of things but in places where there's hardwood, like where Mike was dealing with, what they did, it's worked tremendous. And you heard him say, I mean, he saw all the deer were either in the food plot or the burn areas, and that's what you would expect.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. You can burn in March, and then in May, you never would know a fire went through there. You can see some logs with some charred areas on them, so you'd know it that way. But the green is just unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's knee to thigh high by this time of year. In early June, it's just incredible. So it's good stuff.
So when you think about, did you put in so you got your bedding area and then you've got your food plot, did you put any buffer areas or anything in there around the food plot so as they transition out from one to they have a few stages of cover, if you will, versus it being kind of a hard break into a flat food plot?
Yeah, I've tried. I mean, I've got, I think, about 15 or 20 food plots on the property, 1 to 2 acre type areas. And, it's edge feathering, I guess, is what most people call that. And so, yes, I've done quite a bit of that, but it's a never ending job. By the time you get all the way through it, it's time to start over on that stuff again. So it's a lot of work. I wouldn't want to scare anybody off by saying that, depending on the size of your property, but it can be a lot of work. But yes, it's incredible. You start, cutting down. It's incredible how quickly that nature reacts to sunlight hitting a forest floor. And particularly when you burn that leaf litter off of it, it's instantaneous almost. But even without that, within a year or so, you're going to start getting the stuff you want to see around the edges of your food plot.
But that's another thing, Brian, when you're cutting your timber and you're building your food plot, you take in consideration about that soft edge that transitions from the clear cut or the timber or whatever. And you make that food plot with that in mind, knowing that you're going to put maybe 10-yard strip of switchgrass or, whatever it may be. So you want to think about that when you're building the food plot and make sure that you build it big enough to accommodate that soft edge. To me, when you've got hardwoods and you've got a situation a lot like Mike's and you're doing the burns, the burn area can actually even serve as your soft area, your transition area. So it's to me, it's a less needy thing. Really, I'm not so big on having a soft area when you're transitioning over from cut timber, because they're bedded in it. They might come up and stand. They might stand 5 yards back in it and study the situation before they walk in. But it kind of serves both purposes. And I've sat here, like, I look at Shaq. I mean, it was a pretty hard cut that had been cut for 7 or 8 years, and he right up to the bean plot. So he was walking straight out of that into the beans, no problem.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just mention one thing on top of that. If you're going to cut hard, it's going to be a jungle. Like within a year or two, it's going to be a jungle you can't walk through. Which is good. It might not be as good for turkeys as it is for deer. But one thing that I've really liked is where we didn't cut as hard, which left the ground wasn't covered with just treetops after they cut. And then go back in, because they're not going to cut your hollow beech trees. And a big hollow beech tree can shade out 1/4 of an acre on its own by itself. They just have a huge canopy. And your maple trees and stuff like that can shade out a lot of area. So what I found I really, really like is after they cut to go back in there, particularly where they don't cut too hard and there's some open ground in there, and just girdle those those remaining maples and beech trees and let that sun get in. So now you got a good combination of some cover with some treetops and things like that, but you got a bunch of open ground that's got, knee high to thigh high vegetation going. I mean, just great poult brooding area, and there's a lot of benefit, and the deer will bed in that as well. And it's got food and bedding in it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, speaking of turkeys, did you do anything specific on the turkey side to improve some of that habitat?
I think when you're doing the things we're talking about doing, when you're talking about burning turkeys, they benefit the most, I think, from burning. And so, it's been very, very good for turkeys. Some of the areas that we cut on one end of the farm did not have as many turkeys as the other areas. But so it's been a couple of years since we cut that in, and the numbers just keep going up on that end of the farm. You got the food plots in there that were never there before. It was cut a little bit harder in areas, but I also left a 7-acre section here that didn't have any cut, on it. So I've left some open ground up there and tried to just create some diversity of habitat.
Yep.
And it's been excellent for the turkeys.
No, I think they absolutely love that diversity, as you said, and that's beautiful to watch. The numbers grow like that. So good tips here. Now, Mike, let's get into some of the hunting. Like, give us a few success stories. You shot a 160-ish deer. It seems like not too long ago, but talk about some of the successes of all this hard work and sweat equity, financial equity. At the end of the day, we're talking about killing properties, not just habitat.
Yeah, I'll mention just a few that I think are pretty interesting. So we had, this would have been just a few years ago, we had a big buck at one of the farms that we had just picked up. He moved in kind of mid-October. A lot of times they'll get up and move ranges in mid-October, and this buck was the one we knew from the year before, a real good buck. And he had blown up pretty good. He was a mid-160s buck, now, and he had just moved in. Of course, in Kentucky, you have a lot of opportunity in that pre-rut, and most people think, it's an October lull and stuff like that. I mean, Spook taught us, and we've realized it since, that's not the way to think about October. You can kill your best bucks in October before the rut, and that was the case here. So we had the food plots all geared up, and this buck was he was out in our food plots every afternoon. The early muzzleloader season in Kentucky, I think, is the third weekend in October, and Saturday night, my buddy was in the stand, and we were ready for this buck, and I was sitting in another little plot somewhere, and I heard him shoot, and I was like, he got him. So we got together after the hunt, and he was hung up with some does out at about 200 yards, a little bit of a long shot for a muzzleloader, and he missed him. And he told me, he said, the does ran off, but the buck just stood there looking around. And I'm thinking, that buck didn't know what happened. He just heard a shot. He didn't think anything about it. And he couldn't go back the next night. And I said, well, send your kid up here. I'll sit with him and we'll get this thing killed. And he texted me. I was sitting in church on Sunday morning. He texted me and he said, the kid isn't going to make it. I was like, all right, well, I'm going up. I'm going up then. And so literally,
like I used to do, Daddy said, I'll save you spot for you.
And I mean, an hour before dark, there was already 6-7 deer out in the food plot. But luckily for me, he popped out on my side of the food plot that night. So I had an easy 60-yard shot on him. And again, picture taking was over. And I mean, there's still 30 minutes of daylight left. I mean, I killed him way before dark. And, I'll mention that one I mentioned with the juvenile hunter, and it's not the only juvenile hunter, but that buck was a real good buck. Now, he was not coming out in daylight much. He was coming out just after dark, and Spook can relate to this because he's told me 100 times. And so the juvenile weekend is the second weekend in October in Kentucky. So most people would say very early and not great time to be out in the woods, but we knew better by this time.
Yep.
And Saturday we hunted with the kids, not much going on. And we only hunt the afternoons. And this is what Spook taught me, before that rut starts, don't get in the woods in the morning. You just spook and stuff. And so even these kids coming up to spend the whole weekend with us to hunt, you can fish in the morning, you can do whatever you want, but we're not hunting in the mornings. It'll be an afternoon hunt. And literally there was one of those straight line storms that blew through in the middle of the day on Sunday, that comes through with a vengeance for about 20 minutes and then it's gone and the temperature dropped 15 degrees. And I told Tony, I was like, you better. He had one of his kids. It was but he had two sons and there was two buddies, and one of his sons was away somewhere on some other kind of trip doing something else. And I said, you better figure out which one of these kids you want to kill this buck, because he's coming out tonight. And it literally, we 2 hours before dark, we had 6 bucks in the field at one time. And one of them was this mid 160s and another was a 4-year-old that was already, pushing 150 inches that we weren't planning on shooting. And this kid made a great shot on him and killed him. And then this last year, I killed a mid 160s buck, and it was the third afternoon I sat, and it was a 6-year-old buck. But the second afternoon I sat, I had another target buck. I watched him come 150 yards down the food plot right to me, and he was just about to get within range, and something spooked a squirrel. It wasn't even really that close to me. It was on the other side of the deer from me. Something got him all rattled, and he started making a bunch of racket, and the deer just got nervous and picked his head up and walked out. But it was a blessing because we ended up letting that deer go, and he should be a giant this year. But that's October 2nd, I killed the one I killed. It was a 6-year-old buck we've been watching for 3 or 4 years. So, but yeah, it's shortened my hunting season quite a bit. So, but it has lengthened the amount of time I spend in the woods. So I spend a lot of time in the woods the rest of the time of the year, kind of preparing for that. So
well, congratulations, and what I would imagine such a great feeling to not only shoot a great deer like that, but to do it on your own land, your own sweat equity, your own hard work, and kudos for you for reaching out and learning. And so, Mike, if somebody that's listening is in kind of the mindset of in the next year or so, they want to buy their own property, what advice would you give them? Like, not just on the buy-in side, but okay, you buy it, then what's next?
You hire Spook to come tell you what to do.
Well,
yeah, exactly.
I'm trying to tee it up, Spook.
I'll say that a little differently. All the habitat stuff that we're talking about, it plays into a lot of aspects. Number one, in order to get big bucks, you got to let them grow. And one of the biggest problems people have with that is fear that your neighbor's going to shoot them before you do. I mean, it's that if you had a 5,000 high fenced area you were hunting in, you'd let them go until they got huge because you're not worried about anybody else killing them. But creating that habitat helps keep them on your property. So that is a deterrent to your neighbors killing them. So, what I would tell somebody is doing all this habitat work is going to make your hunting better regardless. It's going to help keep these deer on your property. But, when you make a mistake during the rut, that usually means you're moving your tree stand 20 yards to a different tree, or you're hunting a different wind for this stand. It's stuff that can be fixed the next time that you come out to hunt. When we're talking about this predictive hunting of setting your property up to where you're killing these pre-rut bucks and these post-rut bucks, those are decisions that you can't undo very easily. Where I'm going to put this food plot, where I'm going to cut this timber, where I'm going to put my pond, in this food plot. All those things are strategic things that have long cycles of learning, meaning they can't be undone. And, once you've done them. And, where to put my road system. People don't talk about road systems that much.
So important.
If you're going to do burns and access and stuff like that, road systems are very, very important. And so that's intimidating. It was intimidating for me being a new property owner and having somebody like Spook that's been there and done that, and not just the habitat management, but pulling the trigger on a lot of big bucks and probably a lot of learning off of some big bucks he didn't get. That's where that expertise is just invaluable. And I'll just say one more thing. When I met Spook, there was a lot of people who knew who Spook Spann was. There was nobody who knew who Mike Logan was, and they still don't, and they never will. But I can tell you that every time I called Spook to ask him a question, he answered the phone. And if he wasn't able to answer the phone, he'd call me back usually within 24 hours. And he might be in Africa hunting something, but in 2 weeks when he got back, he would call me back. And so I always have very much appreciated that, Spook. So it's been great. So
yeah.
Yep.
And Spook, I know you didn't even have to pay him for that compliment, man. That was.
I think sometimes people think that when you come and you help them out, they hire you to help them with their property and their strategy and their hunting. That's it. I mean, I'm not that guy. I love it so much. I mean, me and Mike still talk about different things, all the time. I mean, we'll talk to each other several times a year, and I do that with anybody. I mean, once we engage in that plan, I just about always become friends with that person. And so they're continually calling or texting and asking questions and for ideas. And I don't mind it. I love it. I mean, I get my gratification when I get a picture on my phone from Mike or whoever the person is when they killed a big one. Of course, one of the greatest things to me helping people with this kind of stuff is the phone call I got from Mike and said, you were right. It's really not that hard. And if you do it is hard getting to that point with the work that you put into it, but the hunting part becomes not near as challenging when you can put all the effort into it beforehand. And I know that everybody can't be in a position to own their own land. There again, everybody's limited on what they can do. But whether you've got 20 acres or 20,000 acres, I think you can make a difference on that 20 acres. And I've done it. One of my best places I have to hunt is on 10 acres. And so it's just a matter of dedicating yourself and asking yourself, how important is this to me to make this the best piece of property and the best hunting situation that I can make out of what I have to work with?
Well, yes, it makes perfect sense. One of the takeaways for me, though, is you talk about effort, but it's strategic effort. And that's, Mike, what you did is it's not just working your tail off, but it's being productive and mindful and have a plan that only is for this year, but for the next 3 to 5+ years. And I think that's clearly demonstrated through the work you did in Spook, where I think you can really, how you helped Mike and how you can help others. And the last thing that I would say is that Mike also went into this from a killing standpoint. Some people want to own property and manage it and look beautiful, make some money off of it, occasionally hunt it, and that's awesome. But if you're buying the property to grow big deer, grow a lot of turkeys, to kill these big mature animals because you invested the money, you got to follow a bit of a strategy in order to do that.
100%.
Absolutely.
So,
I mean, there can be different agendas. If you want habitat management plan just to enhance the beautification of your property, and you're going to improve that wildlife habitat. But if you're doing something as an investment or to resell, that's kind of a different plan, I think. And I can do that. It's no problem. I get the most fun and satisfaction out of advising the person and counseling the person on how to set it up to where when there's a 5, 6, 7-year-old deer on your property, how you can get an arrow through him and get to that picture taking time 45 minutes before dark.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, great discussion today. Mike, thank you so much for sharing your examples. I suspect you probably got a few bucks on the hit list. You talked about one for this upcoming season. You might have a few in a rabbit hole you're not maybe telling us about quite yet.
Yeah, we've got a handful of them that should be pretty good this year.
So listen at him. He went from not having any property to having property and being intimidated on all the things that go into it to actually buckling down and do it. And now he's like, oh, we got a handful. Yeah.
Yeah.
We got a handful of bucks we're going to be looking at. I love it.
Yeah. And these are mature bucks. So these aren't just bucks. These are shooter, target, big bucks. Congratulations.
We try to stay off of them until they're 5 years old.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Mike, that's such a great story. Thank you for sharing that today. Not only just, your success, but the idea of just some of your learnings to help somebody else be more effective if they want to go down that journey of buying property, or just they have a chance to manage property that they lease and doing some of the things on that property. So again, congrats and thank you for sharing. And Spook, thanks for having Mike on today.
No problem. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate you, buddy.
Yeah, my pleasure. I very much enjoyed it. So
no, listen, and anybody that's interested in managing their property, obviously reach out to Spook directly and he can help you and maybe get something started. But God bless everybody and wish you tons of success this season, Mike.
Thank you. Y'all have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.